Matsui, who are the co-chairs of the Congressional High Tech Caucus, for joining us today. Looking forward to their remarks to us this afternoon. And then, as you all know, we have a terrific discussion, a panel of experts arrayed to continue the dialogue on these important topics. ITI, as the trade association of the technology industry, is very focused on the industry's response to COVID-19. The technology sector has an important role to play in helping all Americans learn and work from home, assisting with telemedicine, the search for a vaccine for COVID-19, and the role the technology industry plays is also incredibly important as we ensure the security and reliability of our nation's infrastructure, enabling all Americans to work and learn remotely. And the discussion today is focused on the importance of cybersecurity in the current health pandemic. We're very grateful to have with us today the co-chairs of the Congressional High Tech Caucus. First, going to introduce to you and turn it over for remarks to Congressman Michael McCaul. You're all well familiar with Mr. McCaul's incredible credentials in the area of cybersecurity, given his background in the U.S. Attorney's Office of Texas, working for the Department of Justice, focused on national security and cybersecurity issues. He's in his 8th term representing the good people of the 10th District of Texas, which stretches from the city of Austin all the way to the Houston suburbs. He is the ranking member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, in addition to his role as the co-chair of the Congressional High Tech Caucus. Congressman McCaul formerly served as chairman of the House Committee on Homeland Security, again, an area with which he is very familiar. In addition to his committee roles, he actually not only co-chairs, but also co-founded the Congressional High Tech and Cybersecurity Caucus. Mr. McCaul, we are honored to have you with us today on behalf of the technology industry. Thank you for everything you do as a leader in helping raise the awareness of the importance of cybersecurity in the technology sector. With our gratitude, I'm going to turn it over to you for your remarks.
Well, thank you, Jason. I want to thank you and ITI for hosting this important discussion today, as well as the co-chair of this caucus, Congresswoman Matsui. You know, my hometown of Austin, Texas, we have some of the most brilliant, innovative tech companies in the world that are helping us get through this crisis. And while we navigate how to operate our businesses and provide for our families, bad actors are taking advantage of us. Since the start of this pandemic, hackers have targeted federal agencies, state and local governments, and pharmaceutical companies working on the vaccine. Just last week, the FBI and CISA denounced China for attempting to steal valuable medical research pertaining to COVID vaccine. Countries across the world are working day and night to identify a vaccine, and our adversaries would love nothing more than to be the first to commercialize it. As we stay and work from home, we've increased our vulnerability to a cyber attack. In March, cybersecurity experts estimated phishing attacks increased by 667%. Hackers are capitalizing on this crisis, disguising malicious links as important and useful coronavirus safety guidance. In addition, attacks have increased on government entities who are trying to provide essential services to the citizens. Even before the virus, this was an issue. In my home state of Texas, the government was facing up to 10,000 attempted attacks per minute from Iran alone. Last August, over 20 towns in Texas were hit with a series of ransomware attacks. With state IT systems now overworked and stretched thin, there are even bigger targets to attack. 2 weeks ago, the computer network serving the Texas Court of Appeals was shut down after a ransomware attack. And to make things worse, many states depend on outdated systems to provide their services, with some of this technology being from the 1980s. Using such outdated legacy systems, technology slows a government's capability to help their citizens and leaves them vulnerable to these cyber attacks. Simple things like an increase in internet traffic can crash a site, as we saw last month with the website responsible for unemployment insurance in Texas. Simply put, state and local governments are overwhelmed with providing their services already, let alone tackling new cyber attacks from adversarial nations like China, Russia, or Iran. That is why I've asked congressional leadership to include funding to states and local governments to help them modernize their IT infrastructure. Modernizing IT allows us to build faster, more reliable, and more resilient systems. This issue predates the COVID pandemic, as I was an original co-sponsor of the State and Local Government Cybersecurity Improvement Act to provide $400 million in grants for states to mitigate cyber threats. And now, as we have seen with the pandemic, the need to update antiquated state IT systems is even greater. And long after this pandemic is over, the United States will continue to face threats to our nation, whether from an invisible enemy or a foreign adversary nation. Nevertheless, as Americans, we always learn from adversity, and I look forward to working with all of you, not only to defeat this virus, but also to build a more resilient and cyber secure nation. And with that, Jason, thanks again for having me. I look forward to a robust discussion, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman. And I hope you and your family back in Texas, all the kids are safe and healthy. All your team members in the congressional office and back in the district are doing well.
Thank you so much for that.
I appreciate it. And with the conclusion of Congressman McCall's remarks, we have Congresswoman Matsui, who is joining us, and we are grateful to her as well. As the video comes on from Congresswoman Matsui's office, I'm going to take a moment to introduce her, and there she is. Thank you, Congresswoman. On behalf of ITI, welcome. We are delighted to have you here. As we've just heard from Congressman McCall, the Congressional High Tech Caucus is hard at work addressing important issues related to our nation's technology infrastructure and cybersecurity. Congresswoman Doris Matsui is the co-chair of the Congressional High Tech Caucus. Congresswoman Matsui has represented the great people of the city of Sacramento, California, and its surrounding areas in Congress since 2005. She's a senior member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, where she co-chairs the Congressional High Tech Caucus, but also serves as vice chair of the Congressional and Technology Subcommittee of House Energy and Commerce. We are absolutely thrilled to have Congresswoman Matsui with us today. On behalf of ITI and the technology industry, thank you, Congresswoman, for taking the time to join us today. And I'll turn it over to you for your thoughts on these important issues.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. And I'm really sorry I got on the line a little bit too late here. But I know that Michael McCall has been there, and really appreciate him being my co-chair of the High Tech Caucus. We've been having some formative times together, and it's been really great. But I want to thank ITI, and I want to thank you, Jason, and I want to thank all the participants who are going to be with us today. You know, I think all of us would rather be meeting in person, but you know how that is. But I'm really glad that we're taking the time to really discuss a topic that really has far-reaching consequences and will require ongoing public partnership in the sense of collaborating. Cybersecurity in the time of COVID-19. Now, this pandemic has required all of us to make changes to the way we work, shop, and communicate. While these steps are necessary to really stop the spread of COVID-19, they've been brought to light new cybersecurity challenges and really latent vulnerabilities. This pandemic has accelerated really a fundamental change in the nature of work, which has happened over the last 15 years. The share of the labor workforce that works from home has tripled, according to the Federal Reserve. And this comes with an increased use of personal devices, reliance on cloud services, which we really may not be secure, and more traffic on vulnerable networks, and actually burden IT departments, as we know, working to keep up. Now, though we're facing pressing challenges, we also have an opportunity to refocus our efforts on policies that will strengthen cyber leadership and reinforce American leadership. Now, in Congress, I'm working to advance cybersecurity with legislation like the Internet of Things Standards Leadership Act that Michael McCall and I are leading, that we introduced. And this bill will really strengthen national economic and security interests by promoting U.S. participation in the international standards setting bodies, which I think is really critical. The next generation of communications networks and IoT devices will offer transformative benefits, which will really, for consumers and industry. And to harness their potential, it is critically important that the United States plays a prominent role in international standard setting for these technologies and networks. Now, the United States, as we know, is well positioned to advocate for the consensus-based, industry-led international standards that promote strong cybersecurity protections. Additionally, the bipartisan CARES Act included funding to help small businesses manage the risk and mitigation of cyber threats and remote customer service or telework practices. Helping small businesses recover from this pandemic must be a national priority, and I'll continue to work to ensure federal support includes cybersecurity alongside assistance for payroll and utilities. In addition to increased funding, we need best practices and clear guidance for those working from home. Many employees are interacting with VPNs and other remote technology for the first time, and they need training and resources to understand how to work from home securely. NIST has done important work helping organizations manage risk through their cybersecurity framework. Their flexible framework has helped organizations, large and small, assess their cybersecurity risks. For the framework to be responsive, it must be a living document. That's why I'm going to be calling on NIST to continue work on the framework by advancing metrics and measurements to evaluate cybersecurity strategies. A NIST framework that includes cyber metrics can provide a useful framework to guide decision-making, maximize the impact of limited resources, and help improve cybersecurity in the United States. Events like this are useful reminders that cybersecurity will not wait for this pandemic to be over, and neither can we. Vigilance, collaboration, and creativity are necessary, and I'm confident that our cybersecurity leaders on this call are up to the challenge. I want to thank you very much for letting me participate today and for our panelists' perspective on these crucial issues. And I really want to thank my good friend Michael McCall, which, you know, we just wave each other and that's about it. And even when we come together, as we did last week, you know, we have to vote in small groups, so we can't even see each other and we have our masks on and everything. So it's good to see you, Michael, without a mask on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and really appreciate your remarks. Both Congresswoman Matsui and Congressman McCall have been pioneers in raising the level of discourse, bipartisan discourse about the important cybersecurity and technology issues we face. Congresswoman, I hope all is well with you and your family and all of your great folks in the congressional office and in the district, and everyone's healthy and safe.
Well, thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you.
You all too. Thank you.
Thank you for your remarks. As we heard from the terrific co-chairs of the Congressional High Tech Caucus, cybersecurity and the technology industry are in the spotlight like never before. Every American is in some way touched by the technology industry in ways that they haven't been historically, either because they're working remotely, they're learning remotely, they're accessing medical care using telehealth facilities. And all of this infrastructure, the broadband infrastructure that makes this possible, wired and wireline, all of the tools and technologies and equipment and services that make this possible, from cloud services to tablets and laptops and smartphones. All of these have cybersecurity implications. And we need to make sure that we are securing our networks at the same time that we're relying on them more than ever. The ITI member companies are very focused on this issue, ranging from providing cybersecurity solutions to providing secure technology products and services. And so we wanted to have a discussion on the issues raised by Congresswoman Matsui and Congressman McCall about these important cybersecurity issues in the time of COVID-19. We have three terrific experts who are involved in providing the products and services that consumers and businesses rely on and are really on the ground focused on these issues every day. And to moderate that discussion, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, John Miller, who leads all of ITI's policy work on cybersecurity. John, over to you.
Thank you, Jason, and thanks very much for your comments, Congressman McCall and Congresswoman Matsui, and welcome everyone. So we'll get right into it now. As Jason mentioned, we have excellent cybersecurity experts, and we're going to have a great discussion on this topic. Let me briefly introduce our panelists. Ron Bouchard is Senior Vice President and CTO for Government Solutions at FireEye, where he leads a global team of subject matter experts in security operations, incident response, security programs, industrial control system security, and penetration testing, developing and delivering innovative security programs and solutions and services for commercial and government clients worldwide. Bob Huber is Chief Security Officer and Head of Tenable Research at Tenable. Bob has more than 20 years of information security experience across financial, defense, and critical infrastructure sectors, and oversees Tenable's global security teams, working cross-functionally to reduce risk to organizations, to the organization and its customers. Then finally, Jeanette Monfort joined Google earlier this year, where she serves as Global Director of Government Security and Compliance for Google Cloud. Jeanette came to Google after a distinguished career in government service, where she most recently served as the Assistant Director for Cybersecurity at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at DHS, and previously held numerous other positions at DHS as well as the White House NSC. Just a couple of notes before we begin. At the end of our discussion with the panelists, we will open up the conversation for audience questions. To ask a question, please use the chat and raise your hand in Zoom. And for those joining by phone, please press *9 to be recognized. When asking your question, please introduce yourself and your company. So let's get right into it. I think both of our previous speakers already talked a little bit about the changed threat landscape that we're dealing with in the face of COVID-19. So I'd like to direct my first question toward Ron. We really are seeing both a new wave of opportunistic cybersecurity attacks as well as familiar cybersecurity threats, such as the phishing attacks and ransomware attacks that were mentioned previously, increasing dramatically during this crisis. Can you describe in a little more detail the cybersecurity threat landscape and how it's shifted during the COVID-19 crisis?
Sure, John, absolutely. And thanks for the time this afternoon to talk about this important topic. So I think Congressman McCall actually captured it really well. There's two main through lines we're seeing with threats related in cyber that are either taking advantage of or operating in this kind of changed environment. So number one, the traditional adversaries we deal with on a daily basis, both nation state and criminal groups, haven't really stopped or slowed down in any significant way their traditional cyber attacks and methodologies. So in a sense, they're just taking advantage of the distractions and the increased challenges that everybody's dealing with to continue their traditional cyber criminal activities or cyber espionage activities. And then there's the other piece that Congressman McCall touched on, which is the direct advantage focused on leveraging both worry and concern as well as distractions related to the pandemic, everything from the healthcare related topics and issues to payments and financial support mechanisms to leverage trust and curiosity and just natural distractions of people to gain access either through targeted phishing or other types of social engineering vectors. And we have seen a huge increase as a company globally in the use of those types of attacks and lures to gain access into environments. But I think it's the third through line I would touch on is at the same time that we as a company globally are seeing a huge increase in attacks and response and organizations struggling with, again, both that traditional continuation of cyber attacks as well as the new wave of, COVID advantaged attacks. A lot of organizations, for obvious reasons, are extremely challenged to continue or to begin any sort of significant security transformation or IT modernization, as Congressman McCall also touched on. So you've got a combination of a slowdown or a pause in any significant security maturity capabilities for organizations while they're dealing with the crisis and just trying to keep the lights on, so to speak, while you have an increased threat environment. And so that creates a perfect storm of real challenges for organizations to continue to try to operate, continue to maintain a remote workforce in some sort of efficiency, and while also dealing with a remote security team or a distracted security team and dealing with an increased level of attacks and focus capabilities that we're seeing across many industries, government included. And so I think we're going to continue to have to work through that over the next couple of months. I do think, as was stated in some of the other remarks, that these challenges won't end when the pandemic is over. We're all dealing with the fact that there's a new normal that we have to think through, both from a remote workforce, cloud enabled, capabilities, but also how do we protect that infrastructure and how do we deal with the next situation that limits what we can do physically and pushes us even more into internet enabled virtual and cyberspace operations and thinking through the impacts and risks as we build those more resilient systems and infrastructure going forward.
And I think Ron raises a very good point in regards to terminology. So when we say IT modernization, and previously we used, cloud first, I think we always need to say that in light of security. So IT and security modernization, cloud with security. As he noted, the attack surface has shifted. Now we have these remote employees, and our security controls didn't necessarily shift along with that. So they're not traversing corporate networks to a large extent. So we lose some visibility there. And we have significant concern and issues with people using personal devices. So bring your own device policies, where we might not have our security controls. And we have to think with that mindset as we transform the IT organization as a whole, that security has to come along with that.
Thanks, Bob. Jeanette, I don't know if you wanted to chime in at all on the threat piece of the puzzle here.
I think it's been pretty well covered. We've put out some information publicly, just that sort of striking that balance of every time something happens, actors are going to take advantage of it. And sometimes it's just a matter of changing the subject line from, here's your free hurricane relief to, check here for the latest on COVID. And so I think we definitely see a lot of that sort of traditional phishing. Gmail is blocking just hundreds of millions of those on a regular basis. And then the taking advantage of that lack of visibility, potentially as employees are working from home and thinking, maybe they're less vigilant in crossing between their personal devices and their work devices. So I think those are some of the main themes that we're seeing.
Thanks. So let's move beyond the threat landscape and talk a little bit about business continuity. I mean, that's one of the things for certain that the COVID-19 pandemic has taught many of us. I think both about the importance of recognizing technology workers, including this cybersecurity workforce, as essential to maintaining business operations, and also in some cases, unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted that some organizations, weren't necessarily prepared for the type of mass business disruptions to supply chains and other major parts of businesses that many have experienced due to COVID-19. So let me turn it over to Bob just to see if he has any thoughts on the enterprise risk management picture and what lessons companies should take away from the pandemic regarding risk management, planning, and security.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thanks everyone for your time. So, to take it up a level, enterprise risk management is concerned with risk to the enterprise as a whole. It's not just cyber, it's strategic, operational, functional risk to the enterprise. The World Economic Forum in their risk analysis has identified cyber as a number 2 risk across the globe. I think before this pandemic, many organizations would be very hard pressed to tell me that they had accounted for a global pandemic in their top 10 enterprise risks. I think that would cascade into they probably didn't have business continuity in their top risks, and taking that a step further, they probably didn't have an economic downturn in their top 10 risks to be addressed. And the reason why that's important is you relate this to the leadership of your organization, in my case at Tenable, to the board. If you relay the top 10 risks for the enterprise, they want to see mitigation activities against those risks. And, for us, cyber is a top risk, just like the World Economic Forum. The other ones, pandemic, being honest, that was not in our top 10, so we worked quickly to address it. But what we did do is we conducted a business impact analysis, which is how you plan for business continuity events. And the pandemic is an extension of a business continuity event. And I think the lesson learned here from that analysis is, before the pandemic, if you didn't know what was important or urgent or critical in your value creation for your organization, you certainly do now. I guarantee you do now, whether that's running payroll or providing a service or building a product or manufacturing, you know what's critical. And the fact of the matter is, when I look at protection of the enterprise, I have to prioritize my efforts against what I understand to be critical from the organization's value creation process or business processes. So that helps me with a plan of attack of how do I go and address all these different scenarios with my shifting landscape. Well, now I know I can take my resources, I can focus them on the critical components that matter. And that extends, by the way, into my third party provider. So my supply chain itself, which, most organizations will have some type of security assessment questionnaire to gauge the security of their supply chains. And point in fact is, there's really no standardized metrics for how we go about doing that. And I know there's been some work by Congresswoman Matsui to, help identify through NIST via some type of standardization on metrics of, like, how do I gauge the security of my suppliers? Because at least in our enterprise, those are critical suppliers to us and to the services we provide. And right now we don't have a great mechanism to do that. So things like, the NIST cybersecurity framework as a validation tool and providing meaningful metrics around that for continuous monitoring and validation would go a long way towards helping us ensure that not only are we addressing the issues within our enterprise, but also our supply chain.
Yeah, I'd echo off of what Bob said as well, related specifically to something we haven't touched on too directly here, but I think Congressman McCall, again, maybe touched on it in his opening remarks, which is not only kind of the traditional cyber espionage and data theft, but the increase in ransomware and extortion types of attacks. It's definitely on the rise. I would think, we attribute certainly some of it to, again, the challenges everybody's dealing with in this environment, but also just the increased pressure that organizations are going to be under at this particular point in time if they are hit with a disruptive malware attack, to resume operations as quickly as possible, and think probably putting more pressure on a consideration to pay an extortion or a ransom in order to get through that incident, especially if they don't have business continuity or continuity of operations planning in place, and they really don't have a failover option. And certainly, I think, again, adversaries think through these models, and they do it very quickly, and they can test their theories very quickly as well, and they don't have to go through any sort of operational considerations to do it. They can just put it out in the wild and see what works. So we are we are challenged in that from that perspective of dealing with not only, again, the heightened challenges of just general operations, but the increased pressures that are put upon business leaders, decision makers, and organizations in general when they are put into a situation of disruption, due to a cyber attack.
I think I would just, sort of kind of what Bob was talking a little bit about, and the excellent point around, knowing what's most valuable. And, as for years in my government role, and whether that was through the development of the NIST framework or thinking about critical functions, is that oftentimes cyber is not included, or I wouldn't even call it maybe cyber, but more of your digital footprint, your digital dependence. And it was sort of put off to the side and not really thought about as an enterprise risk. And I think this whole situation has really forced businesses and agencies and all sorts of organizations, from very large to very small, to really think hard about and learn lessons, frankly, about what are they dependent on, both from a digital perspective as well as even just relationships. And where is that most valuable data? And on the positive side, I think it's giving people insights that they wouldn't have otherwise had. Just very simply, if everybody wants to access a certain application, that you may not have realized why that one particular one was so valuable. So that there's information that you can glean there, or that your supply chain wasn't as clear to you as you had previously thought. So I think ideally, longer term, we can help, not just within our own organizations, because I'm sure each of our companies have had very sort of similar experiences of learning things that we didn't previously understand, but sort of helping the industry as well as all of our customers to think about our digital dependence and truly understand that and talk about it and articulate it as a part of our overall enterprise risk. And we have a responsibility to help those who use our services, of course, to do that. But hopefully that will be a very positive outcome once we're all able to get back to normal.
Thanks, Jeanette. And sticking with you, I think you mentioned that it's really the COVID-19 situation, I think you called it, is really highlighting how important not only cybersecurity but technology really is. And I think it's fair to say it's really spurring a fundamental shift in the economy right now. I mean, clearly a significant percentage of the workforce, arguably almost everyone, is working from home, attending meetings and webinars such as this via video conference, likely working remotely in the future on a much more consistent basis. What types of cybersecurity challenges are we really, do we need to grapple with as we all undergo this ultra rapid digital transformation from really both a public and a private sector standpoint? And I think the term IT modernization, for instance, has been thrown around a couple of times already in the discussion, and it really does go hand in hand with cybersecurity.
Yeah, and I think the Congressman McCall said it very well, is you can't really fully capture security modernization without a broader digital transformation effort. And many organizations, whether in government or commercial, for a variety of reasons, priorities, investment needs, all these things, had just really didn't sort of grapple with that, and that need to modernize that legacy infrastructure, modernize their practices even, and thinking about sort of the way that that security is done. And so from our perspective right now, the biggest challenges are really operational. People need capacity. People need to figure out access. How do they get that remote worker access in a somewhat trusted way to those internal applications, as an example? And so I think we as a company have had a benefit of 10 plus years ago when we said we're not going to use VPNs anymore. We're going to enable an ecosystem where there's no trust. You can work from any network, and so we have a 10-year journey that we've been on, and unfortunately many people I think feel that they have to achieve that 10-year journey in 10 weeks. And so which is in one sense it's great. Love to see the energy and the focus, but you do run the risk of either breaking things that from your security or your operational perspective, and importantly making things more challenging to maybe institutionalize in the future. So we're sort of thinking of it right now is how do you sort of deal with this need for this capacity, whether you're a government agency that's dealing with a massive rise in citizen requests for information, or even just trying to get to your website to see what's going on. So how do we deal with that? How do we build a foundation for a future where people can truly invest in sort of a zero trust concept and mindset, and but not trying to solve every problem right now, and not trying to achieve that 10-year transformation in that 10 weeks, but navigating where you are at the present, understanding what's most valuable, what do you need to continue to protect and to monitor, and but build that foundation for a future digital transformation when you're ready to make that journey. But yeah, I think this is just whole the whole pandemic has just highlighted for so many people that the lack of investment in modernizing their technology has really made it difficult to be as agile and responsive and do it in a secure way.
Yeah, and to pivot off of what Jeanette said, I wholeheartedly agree. Like fundamental architectural decisions and the way we think about trust and data protections in complicated environments has to certainly be kind of foundational to any sort of both digital and security transformation. The other thing we're focusing on now, because customers, especially in this period of time, are struggling with so many competing priorities and such limited bandwidth, resources, funding to execute any of it, is to really try to get focused on the threats and the things that matter most. So modeling and being able to validate a security posture against the most prevalent or the most impactful or the most relevant threats to an organization, and specifically in the environments that matter most to the company, are probably being able to highlight that to executives and leadership to focus efforts can be hugely impactful. So what we're trying to also encourage is, in addition to that grand 10-year plan, how do you get better quickly? And the best way we've seen to do that is to actually validate your assumptions of what your security posture is against, again, the most relevant threats that you're likely to face, the most impactful business issues that you could face if there were to be a cyber attack against you, and model those in a way and simulate those in your environment in a way that can actually tell you factually, yes, we're well protected, we can see this type of attack and we can defend against it, or no, we can't and it will get through and we will be in bad shape. That's where you can really focus some concentrated effort quickly to close at least some of those gaps, right, while you're working through those larger challenges. So to us, it's a question of prioritization and not trying to do everything at once, and really honing in on the things that matter most for the organization and getting those complete, and most importantly, actually testing your assumptions and making sure they work the way you expect them to against threats, as close as you can possibly model them. So that threat-centric, risk-focused approach, I think, is critical to success, especially in this constrained time where you just are not going to be able to do all the things you would like to be able to do to fully modernize your capabilities very quickly.
I think that's key. It's all about prioritization. As I say on my team, it's prioritize everything, right? So it's prioritizing assets, functions, services, plus your vulnerabilities, plus your threats, because I can only do so much at the end of the day, as can any organization. The peanut butter approach works to an extent, some basic coverage aspects, but there are some areas that require additional focus, and understanding what they are goes a long way towards running an effective program. So Jeanette had mentioned, there's no trust anymore. So security has to move wherever the asset or process or even the people are at. And that's something that's been a little bit difficult as we look at people now who are either working from personal devices, BYOD, or as I've seen often is people are working around the system because they're just trying to do their job at the end of the day. So they're going and identifying solutions out there that may help them do their job that they couldn't access through VPN or some other reason. So still get their work done, but unfortunately we don't have those protections in place for them, nor are we aware. So we risk a little bit of shadow IT, which is unfortunate because we're not aware of the risk we're accepting when we do that. And I'll also note too, as we move to infrastructure as service and software as a service providers, it's still a shared responsibility model. While those providers secure their own platforms and the infrastructure behind them, it has to be made clear to organizations that it's still incumbent upon you to protect the data in those platforms. So if I have a ticketing system or CRM system with my customer data in there, they will secure the infrastructure behind it, but it's our job to secure the information in there. So there's still some work to be done from a security perspective, even if we take advantage of those solutions. And that's why I think Jeanette rightly pointed out, we can adopt those solutions and modernize not only IT, but security and make those leaps to the SaaS providers, but security's got to be a part of that conversation.
Thanks a lot, Bob. And I just want to remind folks, and I think we are starting to have some questions coming in, and we'll get to those in a moment. You can raise your hand, submit it through the chat, or press *9 if you're on the phone. We've already had a lot of great advice from Ron, Jeanette, and and Bob about what organizations should be focusing on in terms of both cybersecurity and IT modernization, as well as broader enterprise risk management. When we heard a little bit from the High Tech Caucus co-chairs at the outset about some of their perspectives on the cyber in the time of the crisis. I guess the question that I have for all three of you is whether you have any thoughts on what policymakers can do to help accelerate a secure digital transformation. Really for organizations of any type, but we've heard a couple of times about the challenges, the particular challenges faced by small and medium-sized businesses, for instance. And I'll throw that open to anyone.
I'll lead there with just touching on national resilience. Obviously, if you think of the whole of government or the whole of nation, there's so many components to the supply chain, the understanding the risk you're accepting in regards to resilience for your supply chain. I think for a lot of folks, that's become very apparent now as you don't quite have the visibility and insight you need to understand the risk of that organization in light of something like a pandemic event and their ability to respond and recover. So, practicing those scenarios, making those requirements, as an organization that is held accountable for FedRAMP and CMMC and some other standards and certifications, that's one of those areas that, we must as an organization address. That's usually a sign of a mature organization. Unfortunately, many organizations don't adopt that out of the gate as an initial part of their program, but I think that's something that has to be stressed and exercised as we develop our supply chains.
So my perspective is, from a policy point of view, I think we've got so much complexity and, quite frankly, a lot of competing guidance out in the space now, both within the U.S. and internationally. I think driving some level of consistency and simplicity and focus and hoping to add clarity, especially for those less mature organizations, is really, can and should be a focus point. And what I mean by that is, you could give an organization a NIST 853 control framework and say, implement all of this, 460 plus controls. They're going to be extremely challenged to get there. So picking from that, right, which is like all the possible universe of good things you can do from security, what are the most important? What are the things that we see have the most impact, again, in risk reduction, in stopping these types of attacks, and giving them a simplified framework that says, if you do these 2 or 3 things as a starting point, and ideally you do 4 or 5 total, you're going to get better. I think those kind of guidance points, from a policy perspective, and then supporting that decision making by relevant, timely information and guidance, by sector, which I think DHS has done a more effective job over the past few years in focusing on the relevant, not just producing an inordinate amount of threat data that, again, is very hard to sift through, but what is the most important information? We know there's a lot of bad people out there. What's most important? Who are the most important bad guys, and how do you stop them? And staying up to date on that, I think can really help focus the attention where it's needed. It's not a panacea, but I do think those are some basic themes I've been seeing and hearing from policymakers, not just in the US, but globally, in terms of thinking through how to build a better, more robust framework for organizations to be successful in this space.
I think it was pretty much well said. That sort of need for an understanding of what is critical, and I'll tout it not just because I worked on it, but the national critical functions approach that CISA is taking, that's a very different approach to thinking about what is most critical, and sometimes what's most critical depends on the sort of the paradigm that you're talking about. What's most critical in a pandemic is different. So you can think about it in different frames, but coming at it from a functional approach and thinking about our ability to be resilient as a country, to be resilient as industries, I think is absolutely the right approach. And there's a lot more work that needs to be done there to think between industry and government about, well, what does that actually practically mean? Because at some point, companies, and governments need to start prioritizing what they're investing in and what they're focused on. And so I think the sooner that we can get to that stage where we're talking about practical actions that we're taking to make, whether it's a certain platform that is widely used, but making that more secure and resilient, or whether it is a supply chain, I think that's a really important step to take. And I would also just say the ability for particularly government agencies to have the investments sources that they need to make long-term in capital investments in the modernization of their technology. Keep saying that. It's very important, and in the ability for, particularly for government agencies to be able to make these long-term decisions is sometimes challenged the way that they're currently sort of funded.
And I believe that in industry, the conversation needs to be elevated to leadership and the board level. And right now, if you have somebody on your board that's cyber savvy, that's fantastic. That's not the norm, quite honestly. And I know there's some recommendations related to Sarbanes-Oxley and adding accountability for cybersecurity in there. That is a mechanism that would force cybersecurity front and center at the leadership level or the board level to have those required conversations on a regular basis, which then would tie back nicely to any standard metrics or norms that should be considered as they evaluate security. Because now, you're lucky if you get the conversation as a security leader with the board or executive leadership. And then two, it's very difficult to benchmark yourselves against industry and peers without some type of standardized metrics that everybody uses.
Thanks, Bob and Jeanette. Let's go to a few questions from the queue. There are several. See how many we can squeeze in. Cheryl Cooper from T-Mobile, I believe, has a question.
Yes, this is Cheryl Cooper. Good afternoon, everyone. And I posted my question. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I posted my question in the chat box, and I wanted to continue the discussion from Ron Bouchard and Bob Hubbard from Tenable. Relative to COVID-19 and its impact on the remote workforce or those employees working at home. And I'm just going to state this because I'm not sure if everyone on the call could see my question, but there has been an unprecedented measures taken that necessitate the use of the internet on a scale that we have not ever imagined. With that, I saw a study that stated there's an estimated 60% of the global population now active online, and this has created, or at least elevated, the largest total number of potential cyber crime victims in history. And it also provides an unprecedented hunting ground for cyber criminals. So getting back to that work from home workforce, specifically with using BYOD, what are you seeing across the industry as far as what are the risks and threats of those employees? First questions, using BYOD. Second question, what are some of the measures that you're seeing companies take to address those threats? Three, we have the potential, the threat of data leakage from those BYOD devices. And then my other question is, what are the legal implications of employees using BYOD? Sorry about that, guys.
Thanks, Cheryl. I mean, so I think the key question is simply, the obvious, issues that are being created by BYOD. I mean, and the lack of, there were several questions in there, but they're focused on BYOD and the new realities that faces. Anyone want to take that?
Yeah. So,
oh, go ahead, Bob.
So a couple of quick thoughts here. So far be it from, at least in our organization, to push required security control to somebody's personal device. Having said that, and I'll put my other hat on, the DoD as an active member of the Air National Guard, the DoD does provide software, security software to its members that we can load on our home devices. I'm not saying that's the right path forward, it's one approach. But I know from my perspective, what we try to do is use verification. So if you're working on a personal device, whatever the platform is, and you connect into either one of our homegrown applications inside our corporate networks, or whether that's into one of our cloud SaaS application partners, we're trying to assess the device of your security when you connect in and make a decision of whether we think your configuration's secure enough to interact with our assets. So that's one simple approach.
So, I mean, my perspective is, cyber threat actors weren't hurting for targets of opportunity before the pandemic hit. Certainly, it's only increased, as you mentioned, with increased connectivity, especially to meaningful assets that they're targeting, and taking advantage of the remote workforce, as we stated earlier. I will say this though, I think we, just to keep perspective, from one point of view, we globally essentially shifted from a fairly on-prem, somewhat remote, in some places remote workforce to, as you said, almost entirely remote. And, and we did it in a matter of weeks, maybe a month. There were some hiccups, obviously, some Zoom challenges that I think everybody's familiar with. But for the most part, we were able to make that transition. And people are, from what we can tell, are fairly productive, and things are, working fairly well from a global infrastructure perspective. So I think in an untested, crisis moment, the fact that was able to switch over is pretty impressive. Now, of course, you still have to follow through with the security, aspects of that. And I think what Bob mentioned is absolutely true. We don't want security to become, the blocker for productivity and for continuing to keep people connected. But we have to be thoughtful about, what controls you put in place. I don't think we should fear if the need is there for somebody to use their own device because that's their only mechanism to connect in and be productive or stay in communication with their coworkers, their friends and family. It's just a matter of putting the right controls around and saying, right, let's make sure that person's, system can't access sensitive data. Let's make sure we protect, that asset as best we can. Let's put some controls around it. So I think a reasonableness approach is the smart, and what we are seeing a lot of organizations that kind of flip that switch immediately and have been tweaking their policies ever since to figure out what the best balance is between continuing that unprecedented level of access and capability while starting to maybe crank down on security a little bit more.
Thanks to you both. We're almost at the bottom of the hour, but we're going to try to squeeze in a couple of more questions if our panelists will indulge us. We'll go first to Mariam Baksh from NextGov, who has a question about that Congresswoman Mitsui mentioned. Mariam?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
Thanks for taking the question. Like you said, it was, I put it in the chat there, it was about the Congresswoman's remarks that she was going to be asking that NIST update the CSF with metrics. And Bob mentioned, this would be really useful, and forgive me if I'm misinterpreting your comment there, but really useful for monitoring and checking the security of your supply chain, your suppliers. But this is true up and down the chain, right? The Congresswoman mentioned that the pandemic is causing more folks, for example, to turn to the cloud, and it might not always be secure. Not all cloud service providers are created equal. So I just wanted to get an example of what some of those metrics might be, particularly as they relate to the cloud, if that's possible.
Yeah, so a couple thoughts here. When you assess a program's maturity or how secure the organization is, coming by quantifiable metrics is very difficult. The majority are very subjective, which makes it difficult as a security practitioner to then inform leadership with reasonable certainty of the risk to the enterprise. So what I like to do is identify the things that I know I can quantify. Patching cycles, patching cadence, the number of vulnerabilities out there. I think those are fairly easy to quantify for most organizations. And then going from there, leading into, types of attacks and using the MITRE attack framework, other avenues that can identify metrics. Fortunately for the most of us, there's no clearinghouse for metrics. And I think there's some recommendation there be something similar created. that would collect metrics similar to that. Because the other point, it's not just metrics. It's how do I benchmark? How do I show to whoever the leadership is that I have reasonable care in my program as compared to peers in industry or other partners?
Thanks. There's one other question that came in through the chat that I'll just ask here, and then we'll wrap up. Stephanie Moore from Cisco was asking about what obstacles do you see to Congress providing support for cybersecurity and infrastructure upgrades during COVID-19? So if anyone wants to weigh in on that.
Well, I mean, I think depending on the angle of the question, I'm not going to comment on whether obstacles to Congress passing legislation. I think the obstacles or maybe the potential for investment to go in a less effective way would be when you're trying to sort of stop the bleeding of whatever bad thing is happening. You're going to put your funds towards that, and that may not be the best long-term investment. And so that's whether you're talking about COVID-19 or rebuilding after a natural disaster. I think those would be sort of some of the obstacles, and to think about if you want to modernize your infrastructure, and Congress is able to provide some of that funding. To be able to think about not just what's going to get me through the next year, but how am I going to do this to set me up so when this happens again, I'm resilient and I have that longer term plan.
Thanks, Jeanette. So I think we need to wrap up now, unless anyone else really wanted to chime in on that. But let me conclude now. First of all, just thank you all for attending. Please join me in thanking all of our panelists for a great discussion. And on behalf of our CEO, Jason Oxman, and everyone at ITI, thanks again to the co-chairs of the High Tech Caucus for joining us. You can catch the replay of this on YouTube if you're interested. Thanks, everyone.